Oh, and slow time down. We'll get back to the tractors. Now that, I think that's a design concept of Ford. Because Ford had, at the time, 3 arms. They had Ford, they had Mercury, and they had Lincoln. But they really didn't have they kind of limited themselves to family cars. It's a bit like GM. If you wanted a nice sedate family car, you got a Chevy. If you wanted a sportier car, you got a Pontiac. And Ford, I didn't get the impression from the American market they really did that. In Europe, if you bought a Ford Escort, there was only the Ford label. There wasn't Mercury and there wasn't Lincoln. So some of the cars that came out as Mercuries were built as large Fords in the UK. And the Ford Escort basically came out in the absolute basic model, which when it first came out, sort of about its midlife, you were looking at can I just turn that on? Yes. When it first came out, whoops, there we go. When it first came out, you were looking at sort of hand crank windows, basic radio, no central locking, basic family car. Fairly cheap, cheap to run, small engine. That wasn't right. Following that one. No. There we go. Following him. Oops. Yep, they are all set. So we're done here. We can now lower this and get it running. But then they went sort of the slightly more luxurious one, which still had the cloth seats, but it had a cassette player instead of a basic radio. And then the next one up would have a little bit more luxury on it, maybe a sunroof, something like that, electric windows. But then the top of the range model had the sort of leather seats, cruise control, air conditioning, pretty much everything you could add to a car at the time. But they also had a sports model which had the similar engine to the luxury one, but it was a little bit more tuned, so it goes faster, or it has better pickup. Plus the car isn't quite so portioned, so they didn't have cruise control, they didn't have the electric windows, the seats were more bucket-like. And for many years they did that, and I don't think they did that in America. So there was never really anything that would compete with the VW Rabbit or Golf as we had, or the equivalent in a Pontiac, for example. But it was, and I think in part it's because of the answer to the oil crisis. In America during the 70s, they just said, okay, nobody can drive faster than 50 miles an hour or 55 miles an hour. In Europe, the government just slapped 20-30% taxes on gasoline, and that encourages people to buy smaller, more efficient cars rather than use less gas by driving slower. And so there's always been this what would you call it, sort of national, I'm driving too fast again, probably need to slow down to about 7 miles an hour. But in Europe there's always been this whole idea of smaller is probably better because it's cheaper to run. And in America that it's kind of taking hold today, but for the most part people still prefer to drive a Ford Taurus to a Ford Escort. And because of that, there's no point building a Ford Escort that does anything other than has 4 doors, 4 seats, and your basic amenities. Yeah, at least that's the way I see it. In Europe, people, there aren't the, people, when a manufacturer looks at a vehicle they're producing and people are buying a lot of them, they will generally provide more options for that vehicle because it's the model that is drawing people. At one point you're talking Dodge Durango, Ford Explorer, probably to a lesser extent the Ford Expedition, and the obviously the Tahoe and whatever the big one of those is, but they're all sort of, Americans buy SUVs, and so you're going to spend far more work developing an SUV than you are something that's small and cheap and nobody's buying. Why would you have 10 different models of a Ford Escort when you can't sell enough of one model? You can't sell enough of one model to warrant making lots and lots of different types. But in Europe, where everybody's buying a Ford Escort because it's a small family car and cheap to run and what have you, okay, now it's worth developing, the cheapo one for entry level, all the way up to the luxury one with the cruise control and the leather seats and the air conditioning, because even the wealthier people are still buying Ford Escorts rather than Expeditions. Because a tank of gas is going to cost you I'm trying to think now. About $80 for a tank of gas, maybe more. And that's on a small car. Oh yeah, we had... although that said, no, you could buy a Ford Cosworth over in Europe, but the car was built by Ford, and then the Cosworth engine was added by the Cosworth people. So it wasn't a Ford build. So the number on the road wasn't particularly large. It kind of like the in a way the SRT engine vehicles from Dodge and Chrysler. the number of them is vanishingly small. But I had a friend who was a mechanic, and he used to work out of his front driveway. He said one of the guys on his street, one of the old guys on his street, midlife crisis type of dude, had decided, he needed to treat himself, and he bought himself a Ford Cosworth. And he goes round to my friend one day. He said, "You know what? I think there's something wrong with this car. It's really underperforming." And so, his friend my friend sort of said, "Well, I can take a look at it. What you're doing Sunday afternoon? Let's go out for a drive in it." So he said, "Okay, fair enough." And so, the following Sunday, guy with the Cosworth drops around to my friend's house, picks him up, and they go out for a drive. My friend said, "Okay, how's about you drive the car and you can demonstrate the problem you're having?" So I said, "Okay, fair enough." So he pulls off and he does what you're taught at driving ed when you start driving. Sort of, remember in the UK everything's a stick shift. So you drive first gear, you get to about 10 miles an hour, you shift to second. You get to about 20 miles an hour, you shift to third. You get to about 30 miles an hour, you shift to fourth. And this guy is driving the Cosworth like that. So after sort of half an hour of driving, the friend sort of says, "Okay, I think I know what the problem is. Jump in the passenger seat and I'll see if we can do anything about this." He says, "Okay, fine." So they swap seats. My friend gets in. First gear, 25 miles an hour, shifts to second, 45 miles an hour, shifts to third. The guy is sitting in the passenger seat holding onto the edge of the seat. Having finished accelerating up to about 70 miles an hour, the guy who owned the car was sort of, "Oh, it does pick up quite well, doesn't it?" So if you don't drive it like a learner driver. But the lot of power in a small engine, that's something that European engineers excel at. There is a brand of racing in Europe which is basically a stock car racing, and the rules for it are very, very simple. A manufacturer can only enter a car into the stock car race if they have sold, I think it might be 250, maybe 500 units of that particular model. You are not allowed to do anything to the car except replace the seats with a racing seat with racing harness, build a safety cage inside it, and that's pretty much it. It is stock as far as suspension, engine, and everything else. What you are allowed to do is you are allowed to basically tune the engine, but you're not allowed to alter anything. So you can't swap out control computers or anything like that. It is a stock car, but it is well tuned. So it's running efficiently. It's at the best its acceleration can be. Clean out the spark plugs, replace them every race. The basic car maintenance to have the car run very well, and then you race them. Now the cars were limited to, I believe, 2.8 litre engine, 6-cylinder. And for years you had your BMW 3 Series, your GM pretty much a company rep mobile, except it was the sports version. Ford. What size vehicle? It's the size of vehicle between the Escort and the Taurus. I can't remember what they called them over here. They were basically one of those, and they're all six-cylinder V6, 2.8 litre. Typically they had turbochargers on them because that gave them a little bit more power. And then Audi came along one year with the S4, which at the time was 2.7 litre, so it was giving out. No, I'm talking early 90s, before the Fusion came over here. But Audi came out with the S7, which was 2.7 litre, so it was 100 cc's lower than the maximum, twin turbo, and it wiped the floor with everybody else. I mean, nobody could match that car for performance. And they got banned the following year. Basically, no, your car's won. We don't want you playing with the rest of us, and so they weren't allowed to enter the following year. But that was, at the time, so early 90s, probably the best small sedan available on the market. I think a couple of years after that happened, Volvo entered with their was it a T70 wagon, and everybody laughed at them because a wagon isn't a racing car. They did quite acceptably well, and the following year they released the T6, which is the slightly smaller sedan version of it, and everyone said, okay, that's more acceptable as a racing vehicle. But T70 did, it was competitive, and not surprisingly, because I think at the time my local highway police units had Volvo wagons as pursuit vehicles for highway pursuits, because at least on British highways a car couldn't just be a chase vehicle. You had to have some utility in it, and so you had to load it with traffic cones and first aid kits and safety equipment and stuff to clean up, sweep the road with after post accident. They were expected to deal with any situation the police came across, but they were also expected to deal with the fact that people speed on the highway and they needed to be able to catch them. So that the Volvo wagon, it was a 5-cylinder turbocharged unit, was a very, very capable vehicle. And if you thought about it, it wasn't really sort of unexpected that it could perform as a racing vehicle. As I understand it, the Ford Fusion was a European design Ford, and it was kind of about the time where Americans started thinking about smaller vehicles, maybe because gas was getting to be over $1 a gallon. That's expensive. But actually, it wasn't the Fusion. Yeah, the Fusion was a European design, but it was the smaller one. Not the Fiesta. Focus. The Ford Focus. That first came over here. It didn't do too well in America, comparatively speaking. But that was the car that replaced the Escort. and that was quite well received in Europe. Because unlike American manufacturers, at least with Ford, they tended to build a series of vehicles on the same size chassis. So the Ford Escort Mark IV was the same chassis size within maybe an inch or two of the Ford Escort Mark I. Now, if you look at an old Honda Accord around about the 1970s, it's smaller than a modern day Honda Civic, because they seem to add a few inches to the vehicles every couple of years. Every time they release a new model design, they make it bigger. But Ford didn't have a habit of doing that, and the car size above the Ford Escort in England for a long time was the Ford Cortina. The Mark I had a comparatively small engine compartment. It only had a 11 or 1300 engine. It didn't have much weight to it either. It had very nice legroom for front and back, and it had a trunk that you could take a family of 5 with a large suitcase each on vacation. My grandfather, at the time we had our Mark I, had a Mark IV, and you'd be lucky to fit the luggage for 2 people on the back of that, and rear seating was a little bit cramped. The cars were the same length, but it was just that the Mark IV needed to make room for a 2-litre, 2.3-litre engine, whereas the biggest you could get in the Mark I was a 1500 Lotus, which kind of small. Yeah, now that I think that's tuning cars is probably that's kind of it seems to be something that Americans are into, whereas Europeans don't need to be into that. In part because we can buy them stock as a high performance model. Like I was saying, you round about the late 70s, early 80s, when the Ford Golf GTI first came out, Ford started looking at high performance cars in the Escort model. And for a time, not only did you get sort of the base L, GL, and luxury models, but you also got a sports model, which was, it was a slightly better acceleration, slightly different gearing, slightly less fuel economic. But at the bottom of it, it was a basic Ford Escort. But then you also got the Rally Sport 2000, which at the time you had a 1600 cc engine under the hood on a standard Ford Escort. The RS 2000, they shoehorned a 2-litre engine into a Ford Escort, and they tuned the car up so you could buy stock a good performing Ford Escort, so you didn't need to get so heavily into the tuning of a car. You bought the best you could, and then you maybe tuned it up, but you weren't wholesale replacing bits of it because it wasn't needed. And that's the thing. I mean, you take a Cosworth, there's not a lot else you need to do to the car to improve it. I mean, the only gripe I'd have with American muscle cars is they go in straight lines. And partially because, well, your streets are kind of straight. You go to Europe where everything was built in the 12th century and horses could take tighter corners than an American muscle car. You kind of need a vehicle that can handle itself. Hence things small and nippy like, going back to it, the Mini Cooper. Bales, we're going to have to go back and wrap after this. Yeah, back in the 70s I used to watch the International Formula One racing. It kind of got boring after a while when they started bringing in the rules that basically everybody has to drive the same car. I think innovation is what made it exciting. Back in the late 70s, early 80s, it was a manufacturer's championship as much as it was a driver's championship. So although the driver's championship received far more prestige, it really was who could make the best car. No holds barred. And the same was true of the sedan racing, and I think that was until that Audi A4 came along, S4 came along. And at that point they kind of started saying, no, the cars need to be competitive, so obviously the sports body limits what you can do with a car. And when they start doing that, you're now looking at cars that are no longer real cutting edge stuff. They're based on, well, what technology was invented last year that doesn't seem to be too biased towards one manufacturer or another. And that kind of tones down the sport quite significantly. Because I think what a lot of people like to do is back in the, as I said, the late 80s, early 90s for the sedan racing, you looked at those cars and you said, well, in 5-10 years the innovations on those cars are going to be on my car, my basic family sedan. Sort of, there's a level of thought out there that basically says, if you want to see, if you want to look at your car that you're going to get in 5 years' time, go to the Mercedes dealer and look at the latest that they have available. Because what Mercedes are putting on their basic models today is what Ford are going to be putting on their basic models in 5 years' time. They innovated with anti-lock brakes. They innovated with traction control, cruise control, the adaptive cruise control that has started coming out over the last few years on what you could call a regular car. That's been available on Mercedes for over 5 years. Speaking again. And I think, yeah, that's part of the trick. It's not, for a lot of Americans, it seems it's the size of the engine. But the truth is, the suspension is just as important. And yeah, going back to the motorcycle racing, the Norton, I think it was the Norton F1, had the best engine on the track. Like, nobody could compete with that engine if you were drag racing. But because a racetrack has corners on it, you had to have good suspension as well, and that's where that's where the whole motorcycle Grand Prix racing equalised, was because the Norton did not have good suspension. And on a really bendy, winding track, they would lose every time. On straighter, longer tracks, they would win every time because of the setup of the bike. But because the racing circuit is made up of, thinking about Formula One, because the racing circuit is made up of Monaco and Old Silverstone, there's your car has to be you can't specialise too much in one thing or another. Your suspension is as important as your engine. And if your engine is better than everybody else's, you're probably going to win the straight line races. And if your suspension is better, you're going to win the tighter circuits. Me, I'm a suspension guy. First car I had in America was a Subaru Impreza RS. That thing cornered on rails. I owned it in Southern California, which probably wasn't the best of places to have a Subaru, because you get stuck on the highway at 5 miles an hour, and it had a heavy clutch. And I'm getting on a bit. So that was kind of wearing on my ankles. There was one time I went from the 5 over to the Pacific Coast Highway, and it's basically a mountain pass, very winding roads. I mean, we're talking very winding roads, like 180-degree turn, and you're stepping down the side of a mountain. That's at one point. And there was a woman in an SUV in front of me, and she was all over the road. Because she could not keep it between the lines, because she's driving a big, heavy vehicle that's not agile. And my car, I couldn't get past her, but I could stay at a constant speed, stay between the lines. Obviously, I caught up with her in no time flat going over this mountain, because the car was agile. I like that. One of the reasons I liked motorcycles, if one of my colleagues got himself a CBR 750, and he just finished running it in, and he said, "Oh, we should go out on a tour." And it was about public holiday weekend coming up, so I said, "Yeah, okay, fine, we'll go out for a tour." And he came from the south coast of England originally, so he contacted a couple of his biker friends and said, yeah, okay, we'll meet all up at on the edge of South Wales. So he and I had to make our way from London. And he said, okay, well, rather than going down the highway, we'll take one of the main routes. And that was a fun motorcycle road. I mean, it was wide, it was fast, and it wasn't straight. And those types of roads are fun. Actually, that was when I was back on the BMW Tourer, which most people, having read motorcycle magazines in England, will, BMWs handle like pregnant hippos. They wallow, basically, when they go around corners. You have to set up the braking well in advance, have the suspension fully recover before you lean that bike over, or it's going to bounce through a corner and get you seasick. So they were quite impressed with how I got my BMW handle, because I'd ridden it a long distance and I'd had a lot of practice in it. There was one time I worked in a little town, middle of Essex, which is 20 miles to the east of London and further out. And the office I worked in was surrounded by farmland. And there was one day, main computer system was down, being backed up. It was in America and nobody had got to work in America yet to start the system back up so we could do some work. I rode a bike, everybody else drove to work in a car, but they said, oh, one of our guys is going over to America this weekend and we haven't got, his ticket hasn't been delivered. We called the travel agent and they've got the ticket waiting at the office. So can you go and pick it up? Yeah, sure. So it's like probably about a 60-mile ride out to the town where the travel agency was. They gave me all the directions, so I took the bike down there. And the first half of the ride was windy country lanes, and then short step on a sort of a major road, not quite a highway. And so cut the end of this off as well. Got into the town, picked up the ticket, got back on the bike and started heading back. And I'm still on the main road section, although it's narrowed to go through a small village. And I checked the rear view mirror. There are 4 cop bikes behind me. 2 of them, marked bikes with the red and yellow stripes and the blue lights and what have you. The other 2 are stock motorcycles, and I'm guessing they were testing out, they'd had the local dealership sort of, can you provide us with a bike that we can test? And obviously local dealers, yeah, sure, we'll, here's a couple of loaners. So they were on those. Well, obviously I'm in front of them, so I'm just cruising along quite happily. We get stuck behind a truck very briefly, and I managed to get past the truck eventually. And they'd sort of stepped back because they'd seen I was positioning myself for a pass, and obviously let me go. The first 2 bikes safely passed the truck as well, and the other 2 got stuck behind them. So there was just the 2 marked bikes and me, and we were making good progress. We got to the point where I had to turn off and go cross country. They'd disappeared from view in front of me because they were making better progress than I was. And I came round the roundabout onto the side road, and one of the policemen was waiting there. He saw me coming Now, my bike is all white, so very reminiscent of a police bike. I just don't have the blue lights. I always wore a yellow reflective vest and a white helmet. So he sees me coming around the corner and thinks, oh, it's my friends, and takes off. And we're driving down this country lane. Legal speed limit 60. Capabilities of the bike are just you can do 60. I wouldn't go any faster because at that point the bike's going to start, or at least the bike suspension's going to start complaining. But we did about 15 miles. And I think at that point he realised, oh, hang on, that guy behind me, that's not my colleagues. And obviously he's in communication through the police radios, and the two of them pulled over into a roadside pub parking lot, and I carried on going. I was severely tempted to pull over and say, hey, that was fun, can we keep going? My thought was, I am driving the exact same bike as they are. It's just that obviously my suspension isn't as tuned as theirs is. I remember reading a story about the police taking delivery of a brand new, it was a Ford Pursuit vehicle basically, and they took delivery of it, and trying to drive it out of the dealership, and they were having serious problems with it, and I think they figured we don't have the stuff that a police car is loaded with. Yeah, all of the emergency equipment and the fire extinguishers and the first aid kits and what have you. And so they nipped into a hardware store and borrowed a couple of sacks of cement mix, and then they put them in the back of the car, and they could just about make it down to the police station, where they took the cement out and loaded the car up with all of their equipment, at which point the car handled quite well. But the problem was the suspension was so stiffened that it made the car completely uncontrollable when it was empty. And I'm guessing the same's true of their bikes. They do have a slightly heavier suspension because they have a load of stuff that they carry with them. Obviously in a bike, not as much as they carry in a car. But I did notice on my bike, when I drove empty, I had to be much more aware of the road conditions, what the road was planning to do up ahead, than when it was me, my girlfriend, and a weekend's worth of luggage on the back. It was far less hippo behaving like when you were on a weekend's vacation with a second person. So how are we doing? It's 11 o'clock already. And that says it's 19:49 in the evening. Ugh. That is kind of not good for the kind of schedule for this fall. So I wanted to get this field and field 1 done today so that I could do them again on the last day of fall. But that might not work out for us. Either that, or I'm going to be running much later into the evening on the next exciting instalment of Lawfolds Farm, so that we can get maximum amount of silage made as possible. Our friendly neighbourhood constructive criticism boy. If it's the same one as last time, creates an account for 5 minutes, says a bunch of trash, and then deletes it. So we can ignore him. Okay, we will call this field done. There we go. Pull this off to the side. Okay, turn that off. That, download, and turn the following off. Forward, and I'll fold that up too. Well, you're entitled to your own opinion, but there's someone who turned up last week who basically wasn't particularly polite, left a few unhelpful comments, and then left and deleted his account. So